Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm not sure I'm able to give a talk. I think all of us have been flooded with cortisol, and there is going to be a little PTSD resulting from this meeting, but thank you so much. Appreciate that. It is indeed, quite literally, an incredible honor to receive this prize. And I'd like to thank the foundation. I'd like to thank the selection committee. This prize also has a great personal meaning to me because a recipient of this prize in 2001, Donald Cohen, was my mentor at Yale. And he was a trailblazing investigator in autism. And he's been gone for 17 years now, but his presence is really felt every day. And I'm a clinician and investigator, and he challenged me to take my clinical instincts and elevate them to the level of quantitative science. Now, most of what I'm going to present to you today, I think I need to be on this side, most of what I have to present to you today is a true partnership with Warren Jones. I've been working with him since 1999, since he was a senior in college at Yale. And of course, I'm a little biased, but I believe that he's the most promising developmental social neuroscientist of his generation. So keep his name in mind. Something in common, Judge. My first experiences in autism came from living in a residential unit for adults with autism. Those individuals had been in long-stay hospitals all their lives. And so they were all profoundly disabled. And this is what we used to see at the time.
And it's jail for right go.
So as a young person in training, my sense was that autism was inevitable. That autism was about severe intellectual disabilities and language disabilities and severe behavior challenges. But I'm also a developmentalist. I like studying babies. I like studying the emergence of mind and the development of the brain. And so years later, as you heard from Joe today, we began to see babies. And as we began to see babies, this is what we saw. This was, at the time, the youngest child ever diagnosed with autism.
You're blocking the step here.
So let's call her Haley. And we tend to say that the eyes are not only the window to the soul, but the eyes are also the window to social neuroscience. They are one of the more foundational mechanisms of socialization. I was 2 inches from Haley, and it appeared like I did not exist. 5 minutes later, she does this.
Haley up. Haley up.
So Haley could not see me 2 inches from her nose, but she could see an M&M about 5 feet away. So the notion is that her world and her world of experience was entirely different because for most people, the world of people really takes precedence. But for her, the world of things was more important. And in a way, it was really truly an attempt to ask that question. What was going on in her mind that really influenced the creation of our labs and our methods and our concepts? And somehow the answer to that question might open the door to maybe some important insights into what really is a massive public health challenge. So this is autism by the numbers. There are 5.5 million individuals with autism in this country at a societal cost of over $120 billion per year in the US alone. There are over 700,000 children in special education programs at a cost of $39 billion. And this is the number that is ticking in our head because every year there are 66,000 children who are born who will have autism. And yet, of those $120 billion, most of those funds are associated with treating older children and adults for their lifetime for severe disabilities. And here's a game changer. because of the malleability of brain early on in life, because of neuroplasticity, were we to be able to identify children earlier and intervene them early, we might, just might, optimize their outcomes to such a point in which those things that I've just mentioned to you will be things of the past. We will be redefining autism. We will be thinking about autism as a way of being in this world without necessarily those incredible burdens. And yet, in the US right now, and for the last 8 years, those numbers have not changed, the median age of diagnosis of autism in this country still hovers around 5. So for those who know, you remember that Joe mentioned that by the time that we celebrate the first birthday of our babies, their brains have doubled. And their synaptic density has quadrupled, which basically means there is a tremendous amount of change that happens in the first year of life. In fact, the year of greatest transformations in our brain in our lifetimes. And yet in this country, we're still diagnosing children, not because of their autism, but because of their behavioral challenges that they're now facing in schools. So we love babies, and so we need to understand what is that platform of brain development. Babies are born in this utter state of fragility, and without the caregiver, they would die. And they live in this complex world, but what do they see? So lots of complex things, but this really drives their learning. In other words, anything that looks like a caregiver, anything that sounds like a caregiver, smells, moves, looks, interacts like a caregiver, those things have preferential power over a child's attention. And in fact, it catalyzes not only their learning about the world, but the very development of their brains. Now, one thing that was wonderful from learning from babies is this notion that my concept of what autism was when I lived in that residential unit was entirely wrong. The sense was that we're born with brains and brains determine who we're going to be. But a wonderful neuroscience also said that our brains also becomes who we are, which basically means our early experiences also mediate brain structure and function. Those early experiences become reposited in our brains. And so this is the hypothesis that we're working from. Autism is the most strongly genetic of all complex neurodevelopmental conditions. Joe mentioned today that if I have a child with autism, the younger sibling, 1 in 5 of them, will also develop autism. And another 1 in 5 will in fact present with symptoms, subthreshold symptoms of autism. But this is very, very, very complex. There are hundreds of genetic variants that have already been implicated in autism, and you don't go from genes to symptoms. That's not the way that nature influences brain development. So the hypothesis that we work on is that that genetic liability disrupts normative development. Results thereof become autism. So in a way, was this to be true, rather than waiting for children to be diagnosed with autism at the age of 2 and 3 or 5, waiting for the child to have the stroke, we basically studied hypertension. We basically studied the emergence of those normative skills. Disruptions thereof will become markers of autism risk. And so what we really wanted to do is to create these growth charts of social engagement, growth charts of brain development, so that if there were a deviation, there'll be a marker of, not unlike what we have with growth charts of weight and height and head circumference. And so how do we do that? We are trying to quantify something that happens between people, and that's reciprocal social interaction. This is my colleague, Warren Jones. This is a typically developing 5-month-old. And as this child is watching her caregiver on that screen, we're measuring what she's doing, what that baby is doing 60 times a second.
And left, right, dance with your left foot, dance with your right foot, dance with your left foot, left, right. Woo! That's great!
If I manage to change this.
No, baby, you can't have that fork. No, that fork is very...
All trying to get into the head of this little girl. Okay? So this is what we did.
Twinkle, twinkle, little star, how I wonder what you...
So what you saw here as a caregiver in treating the baby, and what you see here is that we took the opportunity to quantify the amount of something called audiovisual synchrony in that. So forget that she is a human being in treating the baby. This is now physical contingencies. What we found out is that little girl and 2-year-olds with autism, as they are engaging with others in treating them, their attention is driven by physical contingencies, such as, for example, the following.
Hi, sweetie. Are you ready to wake up? Come on. Did you sleep well?
So this crosshair tells you exactly where the little girl is looking as she is listening to that caregiver. And she's spending all of the time looking at that mouth. And she's looking at that mouth because that's what audiovisual synchrony is in that person's body, because lip movements and speech sounds actually could occur. So imagine what is that experience, that early experience of looking at a caregiver, but reducing that caregiver basically to a composite of physical features. That's what we're trying to understand. So the next question that we needed to understand is how early did that happen? And so here is a typically developing 5-month-old looking at the caregiver, falling in love with that caregiver's eyes. Now, what about now? This is now a 5-month-old little girl who later was diagnosed with autism. What does she do? She spends quite a bit of time on that mouth, but really, other physical stimuli that are happening there, like movement, also attracts her attention. And remember, what you look at is what you're learning about. How early would that happen? Well, what about the growth charts? So this is what we did. We studied babies from the time that they are 2 months of age. We accompanied them all the way to the age of 24 months. There are 10 data points here. And what you have here is a growth chart of percent eye fixation. So basically, as those babies are looking to the caregivers, how much do they look at people's eyes? And you see this is a growth chart for typically developing toddlers. What happened with the toddlers, with the babies that later were diagnosed with autism? This is what happened. It's basically a free fall for the first 24 months of life. And what you see in front of you here is the unfolding of autism. And as Joe mentioned this morning, we do not do cross-sectional studies. We can't, because at this point in time, there are no differences. But those trajectories are going in different directions. That's the way to study brain. And we did that with another group of children, and this is now a second cohort. The red basically are babies who are later diagnosed with autism. Well, so now we know that this starts from very early on. What we did find out as well is that eye looking is under tremendous genetic control. In fact, when we studied typically developing twins, identical twins, watching those videos separately, there was a concordance rate of 0.91 relative to fraternal twins, which is only 0.35. So in a way, we are genetically predetermined to fall in love with other people's eyes. And here is the funny part. The funny part is that those things that are most highly heritable are also the things that most segregate children with autism. So we're beginning to make the connection between their genetic liability and behavior. So this is a group, the first group of children with autism in this density thing, and this is now a replication cohort. Now, we know how early then, it's really from the first weeks of life, but how often does it happen? I did mention to you that early experiences matter. So how often are children with autism deviating from normative social experiences? They are missing opportunities to learn about the world. This is the platform for brain development. So here you learn about conflict and about emotions and about communication and about everything, okay? But how do you quantify that? So what you're going to see now here, this is basically a space-time distribution of attention to that video by 45 typically developing 2-year-olds. And what you see here, those areas, are what we call attentional funnels. Because typically developing babies, toddlers, as they are watching those videos, they spend 80% of the time looking at the same thing at the same time. So these are enculturation moments. These are things that if you don't pay attention to, you're not going to understand. Well, when we produced those kinds of methodologies, we wanted to know if that too was under genetic control. And in those studies of twins with the typically developing toddlers, what we found out is that, yes, indeed, at microscales of tens of milliseconds. And so, in fact, identical twins are more likely to shift their eyes at the same moment in the same direction onto the same targets, even if they are watching those videos differently. You know what that means? They are creating their own world. They are creating their own social world. Guess what? We are genetically predetermined to be social. That's what those findings mean. Okay? Now, these basically are two fraternal twins watching this video separately. Now, let's watch two identical twins watching that video. Remember, they're watching it separately. So they are creating that world. Now, what does that have to do with autism? Well, this is now a data for typically developing toddlers. This is an attentional funnel on this frame of that video. This is only about a 30th of a second, right? Now, see if I manage to go in the right direction. So right there, this is what the typically developing toddlers are doing. What are the children with autism doing? These are the scan paths. They're diverging. What are the typical children looking at? This is what they're looking at. What are the children with autism looking at? That. Watching the same stimulus, but their brains are learning about something entirely different. Now, this is what we learned. We learned that if we did an experiment in which they're watching, free watching, 5 minutes of social scenes, there are over 500 missed opportunities of learning for these children with autism. In fact, over an hour, or over a 2-hour period of real-life social experiences, there are over 13,000 times that they're diverging, that they are missing an opportunity to learn socially. Think about the number of missed opportunities over a whole year. So we need to think about brain as repositing all those experiences. If your experiences are as unusual as that, I promise you, your brain is going to be also quite different. Now, what does that mean? It means that now we are able to look at how those experiences are repositing in brain. So what you have here is a composite of data for the first 6 months of life in typically developing children. We're scanning children 3 times before they turn 6 months. But the idea is to really bring brain and behavior together. Now, this is now what happened in that scene at the end. I didn't tell you. There is a happy ending. Now, the culmination of that scene is, of course, what is happening over here. These are the typically developing children, and here are the children with autism. In a way, they didn't get much from that video. Now, why this is important to us. Joe mentioned a clinical diagnosis of autism emerging around 24 to 36 months and so forth. Well, this is now a mapping of gene expression, maximal lifetime gene expression of genes associated with brain development. So take, for example, in synaptogenesis. And what you see is that the lighter colors tell you of basically maximal expression. Why that concerns us so much? It concerns us so much, the colors are a little altered in this slide, but what you see here is that maximal expression of those genes are happening much prior to the time that these children are being diagnosed. In other words, synaptogenesis learning, synaptogenesis, basically the learning basis for the brain, maximal expression is happening much prior to the time in which our children are diagnosed. Now, talking about Haley once again, what can we do? What can we do? I mentioned to you that social behavior is under tight genetic control. But autism is a transactional condition. There is genes and there is the environment. What is the environment? Caregivers and peers. And so our approach has been to create early forms of treatment that, one, are going to reach the level of intensity, because if you're having thousands of deviations from normative socialization every day, you need great intensity. How can we achieve that? I'm now in the South as well, and what we know is that we have 1 hour of early intervention a week if the child is identified. So the process has been to actually train parents. Using a parent-mediated treatment, using everyday activities, we can actually engineer the environment where they are. Now, why do we feel that this is important? Because we need to create community-viable solutions. We need to have treatments for which people will have access to, and this is a collaboration with Amy Weatherby from Florida State University. We have web-based, video-based systems to train parents and all. And what we found out is that those concepts of early brain development really have much broader application than in autism, because with poor kids, with kids from disadvantaged backgrounds, those kids are also missing opportunities for learning. They are basically being exposed to 30 million words less than their middle-class counterparts by the age of 3. And the former CDC director, Dr. Brenda Fitzgerald, has called those forms of treatment probably our very best vaccine against poverty. And this has now become a public health movement. Now, here is the summary. The summary is that we used to believe that in order to do something for kids with autism, we need to have somehow find a germ, use an antibiotic, and kill the infection. But the fact is that what we can do is focus on early identification and early intervention so that we can optimize outcomes. Were we to be able to do that, we basically would provide for a very different world for the next generations of children with autism. And our goal is not to cure autism. Autism is a way of being uniquely human in this on Earth. Our goal is to ensure that these children are affording what they need to fulfill their promise so that they don't have those burdens that we discussed. And the idea is that we might be able to change the narrative of autism from one of disability to one of diversity. Thank you very much.
Okay.